So once again, good morning and welcome again to the annual meeting of the Beef Farmers of Ontario. I hope you had an enjoyable evening last night, socializing with colleagues and friends, and we are looking forward to a great program today. We do have a full agenda this morning, which will begin with our keynote speaker, Dr. Vaughn, who will share his perspective on the future of global food security and the role of livestock. And following the break, we will have an interesting panel discussion on meat and beef demand lined up. As usual, we will conclude this morning with our traditional board and answer session. If you have a question for us, we would encourage you to submit it in advance over break to a BFO director or staff. And both staff and directors do have their name tags on them. As we join together again today to exchange ideas, views, and opinions, I remind you to be respectful of one another and to be mindful of the comments you might share. As an organization, we are committed to creating a more inclusive environment for those within our industry and for our consumers. I ask you to join with me in listening and learning from others, including those who may have differing opinions and perspectives. As a reminder, please take a moment to turn off your cell phones or adjust to silent mode. If you must take a call or chat with the colleagues during the meeting, I would ask you to please step outside the room instead of moving to the back. Let's keep the noise to a minimum. I would encourage all of you on social media to join in on the conversation and follow Beef Farmers of Ontario and use the hashtag BFOAGM. That's hashtag BFOAGM throughout the day. As Jack mentioned yesterday, we are live streaming the meeting this year, so as a reminder, you may be seen and heard by people not in this room. Please, everyone, keep your comments professional as you do represent our industry. It is important that all voting delegates remain engaged and participate fully in the entire program today, as you are the representatives selected by members from your counties and districts. One of the outcomes of the pandemic has been our ability to connect with one another like never before. After 2 years, many of us are zoomed out, but technology does provide a valuable tool, especially when we can access a talented speaker from miles away in a matter of minutes, like our next guest and keynote speaker, Dr. Vaughn. Dr. Holder has a bachelor's degree in animal science and a master's degree in ruminant nutrition and microbiology from the University of Pretoria in South Africa. He has a PhD in ruminant nutrition, which he completed at the University of Kentucky, focused on nitrogen utilization and protein nutrition in cattle. Vaughn joined Alltech in 2012, and 1 year later, he was transferred to the Alltech's South African office as a National Director of Research and was responsible for technical sales and research within the South African region. In January of 2015, Vaughn was transferred back to Alltech's research headquarters in Kentucky to lead the global nutritional research in beef species. Since 2017, he has served as a global ruminant research group director, where he heads up global nutritional research in ruminant species. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Vaughn.
Thank you very much, and I really appreciate being here. I really appreciate the opportunity to present this topic, which I'm very passionate about, in front of this audience. And I want to just give really quickly a special thank you to Leanne for dealing with all of my issues and getting this all put together. I'm not the best communicator on email, and I apologize. That was so difficult to organize this, Leanne, but I'm really glad that we were able to put this together, because, as I said, this is a topic that's really important to me. And really important to our industry, because I think, quite frankly, that we do a pretty bad job. Well, mainstream media, first of all, does a very bad job of representing what our role is in this topic, but I don't think we do the best job ourselves. And so this presentation that I've put together is an attempt to give us some information to arm ourselves with as we as we represent our industry and show the world what we actually do, because what we actually do is kind of important, and that's produce food. All the focus is always on enteric methane emissions, but we need to be talking about what we actually do. And that needs to be kept in context in any other conversation that we have. So you can think already that which side of this conversation I'm falling on, and does the future of food include livestock? I think you know the answer to that, but I'm going to tell you, or spend the next 40 minutes or so telling you exactly why I think that's the case. So it has to start, right? It has to start with, if I can get my slides to advance. Oh man, I gave you a sneak preview. It has to start with food production, right? That's the point of us being here. That's the point of agriculture in the first place, is to produce food for the world. So before we ask the question, should we revise the future of food production, which the UN and the Food Security Summit last year was doing, everybody's asking these questions. What does the future of agriculture look like? We need to take a pretty close look at where we are right now, because it's important to consider where we are before we decide what we can change about the future of food production. And there's a really cool paper that was put out by Paul Moen out of Massey University, looking at where we are with regards to protein. Now, remember, protein isn't everything, but it's a pretty important measurement of our sufficiency of food production from a global basis. And when you look at the initial estimates of food sufficiency, you've got a curve here. I hope you guys can see this curve in the bottom right-hand corner. Let's see if I can get a pointer going here. So you can see this curve in the bottom right-hand corner. It shows basically the amount of protein supply and per country and territory. So each one of these bars at the bottom is a country or territory, 190 odd of them. And the green represents plant-based protein contribution, and orange represents animal-based protein contributions to protein security, with the red line going across the data set being the adequate amount of protein for a population. So you look at this and you say, well, we're looking pretty good. We've only got a small handful of countries on the left-hand side. It's the countries that you hear about in sub-Saharan Africa and other areas where we know we have deficiency in food production. But you think, as far as a global perspective, we've got plenty of countries that have too much, and we have a very small handful of countries that don't have enough. So we might be in a good place, right? Problem is, this is crude protein, right? This is total net nitrogen times 6.25. This is not digestible protein. This is also not amino acid corrected protein. And our requirement for protein is in digestible amino acids. That's a problem. The metrics are important. When we're trying to match up protein supply with protein requirement, you have to use the same metric. And when you do that, things get a little bit interesting. When you correct that original data set for the digestibility of mostly plant protein, because the digestibility of animal-based protein is extremely high and consistent, you get a data set that ends up having far less of those countries being above the average daily protein requirement line. And in fact, this is 103 of the countries in these curves chopped off, and the curve B and C. If you correct the poor amino acid supply coming from plant-based proteins, you correct that data set, you end up with more than half of the countries and territories of the world being on average below protein supply requirement. This is a very, very different picture that's not being painted at all these meetings that are happening at the UN, meetings in Italy last year. This is not being represented correctly. And it's very, very important as we decide to make changes to the future of our food system that we understand what those changes are going to do. Because you eliminate animal protein from this data set and suddenly you have a very, very big problem. So important to understand where we're coming from. We need more food, not less food. Any conversation that we have that focuses on environment or social structures or whatever it might be, that focuses on changing the future of food, we cannot reduce food supply. We have to increase food supply dramatically to keep track of the populations that we have in the world. But that just doesn't mean that for the food sufficiency equation, right? When we start talking about the sustainability credentials of different types of food production, you have to keep in mind what we're trying to supply. And it has to be put in context with what we're supplying. Are we talking about greenhouse gases or land use or freshwater use per unit of calorie, ton of food, ton of protein, B12. It matters what you put as the per unit on that axis, because these are all things that we're bringing to the equation. For example, in this metric, this is Paul Moen's data again, and really do yourself a favor and go pull down this paper if you haven't looked at it, because it is quite enlightening. But if you correct the data sets, the traditional data sets that you'll see on land use, freshwater use, and greenhouse gases, and you correct those for the poor digestibility of plant protein sources. In other words, you correct this for both digestibility and amino acid composition. So this is land use per kilogram of digestible lysine, which is the most limiting amino acid. You see, it changes the story here. Land use, yep, we hear this all the time. It requires far less land to produce grains than it does to produce animal proteins. But when you correct it on the amount of nutrients that those proteins actually supply, you end up with wheat and rice being about the same as eggs and pork. Milk being higher, but that's a different piece of land, right? So it's really important to consider what land we're using for these things as well. Fresh water use, I thought, was really interesting, because you go from having eggs, pork, and milk being primary water users to wheat, rice, and maize being the primary water users when you correct for amino acid, digestible amino acid content. So totally different narrative when you correct for the appropriate metrics. Greenhouse gases is just the same again. Wheat, rice, and maize, when you don't correct it, look like that's the way to go for the future of food. But when you correct those for the amount of food that they're actually providing, you end up with rice and maize being more greenhouse gas intensive than eggs and pork. And milk, obviously, because of the enteric emissions, and beef is in the same area, does have a higher emissions footprint. Now, you can go through and look at all of Frank Mitloehner's work, Miles Allen's work from Oxford. They've done a lot of work in understanding what the effect of that methane is and why we don't treat it correctly in most models. I'm not going to get into that today. There are authorities on that topic that are a much better place to speak about those things as well. But again, those are other metrics that matter a lot. These are not corrected for those items. But as I mentioned, it's not just about protein, right? When we eat a piece of meat or whatever we're eating, we're not eating it for a single nutrient. We're eating it for multiple nutrients, trying to create a balanced diet. So we need to be looking at things beyond just protein. In fact, Ty Beale did this work. It's really interesting work, and put this together on what the greenhouse gas footprint would be of different types of foods to provide a third of a typical adult, so you can see it right here, a third of a typical adult recommendation of iron, zinc, calcium, folate, vitamin A, and B12. These are some of the most limiting nutrients in a lot of food supplies throughout the world. And turn the narrative on its head. Beef liver is the most resource or greenhouse gas unintensive food that you can eat when it comes to these nutrients. Whole grains and refined grains are the worst, right? So it's really important when we talk about footprint, whether it's greenhouse gas or anything else, that we talk about per what. Because I tell you what, we can turn the footprint of agriculture off completely. We will also turn off food production and humankind as well, which will take care of all the problems. But that's not really the route we want to go, right? So it's really important that as we go through this process, that we keep these types of things in mind. I'm going to take kind of a segue here, because I think this is a really interesting place, and I talk about the fact that we have to talk about greenhouse gases or whatever it might be in context of food production, right? If it's not got any kind of denominator of food production attached to it, there's no point in looking at it. And the plant-based alternative meats is a perfect way of representing this, right? Yeah, I've got 3 plant-based alternative meats. And I'm going to get to my point in a second, because I don't know how much feedback I can get from the audience, but I want you in your heads just to go through these 3 sources of plant-based meat and see if you can label them. You know, there's the Impossible, there's the Beyond, and there's one other one that you may not be aware of. And see if you can figure out which is which. I don't know how much you guys know about these products. I'm sure they're not super popular in your audience, but just as a matter of exercise, see whether you want to label those 3 plant-based meat alternatives. And I want to really thank Frank Mitloner for this one because I think it's a really cool exercise. But there they are. First one's Beyond Meat. Second one is super premium dog food. And the third one is Impossible. So being a little bit facetious in this exercise, but the point of this whole thing is that these are not food production. When people talk about plant-based meats replacing regular meats, that's from a palatability standpoint. We don't talk about that from a food production standpoint. They are not producing food. If you look at the ingredients list, these are things that exist within our food systems already and are accounted for in our food production measures. Just because you found a way to mix together plants to make them taste like meat doesn't mean you've revealed a new source of nutrients that can enter our food supply. This is super important because the mainstream media is having conversations about alternative or plant-based meats replacing meats in food systems. That you cannot replace food production with food processing. What do you think is going to happen if we do that? Remember the curve that I showed you where we already don't have enough food? This is not a conversation that we can allow to happen. We need to point out the holes in these arguments. The other side of that, which I thought was really cool, Dr. Michael Rogers right there in University of Guelph did some pretty cool work on trying to understand, well, okay, perhaps these plant-based meats don't actually contribute to food security, but maybe we can use them to replace meat in our diets from a nutritional standpoint. The nutritional composition of these things is pretty different from meat, and we won't get too much into that, but let's just look at how they digest. And what does this mean for the health of these populations? Because these things are being pitched as healthier alternatives to meat. So it's important that we dig into that part as well. And I know I'm on a segue here, but I think it's a pretty important segue. What he showed from some pretty advanced digestion models is the fact that not only do plant-based burgers have a ton of carbohydrates in them, a ton of carbohydrates that have a very high glycemic index that contributes towards metabolic syndrome, but that the fat does the same thing. So the fat that is locked up within a beef patty comes out these curves at the bottom here, whether it's cooked, whether it's ground, or whether it's raw. They digest fairly slowly and fairly consistently, which is what your metabolism needs to be healthy. But as soon as you look at the fat from a Beyond Burger in this case, you can see that it immediately spikes up the fat available from that food. The glucose curve looks exactly the same. And what do you get when you eat a ton of food that has a very high glycemic index and a very high lipemic index at the same time? Is you have glucose going into your blood, telling your body to store calories. You also have fat coming into your blood at the same time, and you are just pushing fat into your tissues. Literally the formula for metabolic syndrome. And this is being pitched as a healthy alternative to beef, which has pretty much a flat line on lipid availability. And has no carbohydrates, by the way. The other big piece is, okay, perhaps it's not the best supply of protein or the best thing for you to eat in terms of your metabolic health, but what about your gut health? I mean, I'd say gut health and metabolic health are probably two of the biggest things causing diseases in our population today. One in six people have irritable bowel syndrome or some kind of issue in the gut like that. Metabolic syndrome costs us more than anything else in our system. So we need to be asking these questions as we propose replacing healthy products with unhealthy products. This is also out of Michael Rogers' lab, and you can see how excited he is. I screenshotted these right out of his presentation because I thought they were pretty cool. He looked at the effect of beef burgers versus Beyond Burger on the microbial populations of the gut. And when you feed beef to this model, you increase the abundance of several different species of bacteria, all of which are known to be beneficial to human health. Short-chain fatty acid producers. people who say you eat a lot of meat, you don't produce short-chain fatty acids in the intestine. It's not true. He's shown this directly. Megasphaera prevents diarrhea. Some of these other ones are associated with better metabolic health. Beyond Burger increases Citrobacter and Clostridium populations in the intestines. Citrobacter is a pro-inflammatory bacteria known to be associated with irritable bowel syndrome, which affects 1 in 6, 1 in 7 people. And Clostridium, we know, is not a good thing to have in your lower gut. So really important work here from Michael Rogers, University of Guelph. Certainly go and look at that. He's got some pretty cool models for studying the effects of different types of foods on the gut and on nutrient absorption. But I would also point out, I don't have time to get into it today, but if you want to try to understand what the stuff is doing, very similar experimental structure, but looking at what the metabolic response of the body is to real meats versus alternative meats, I would point you towards Dr. Stefan van Vliet. You put that name, go to his Twitter account, you will find all the information you need on understanding what these things do to the actual metabolism of the body as well. So I'm going to get off of my tangent and go back to the topic, but I really think it's important that we have some of the ammunition to talk about what some of these proposals are being made in terms of the changes to our food systems and the fact that we have to consider that there will be consequences to whatever proposed changes we put into our food system. So I've changed this a little bit, so we don't just need more food, we need more real food, right? That is clear. So what are we going to do about it? Lots of proposals to take ruminant agriculture because they produce a little bit of methane. Take ruminant agriculture out of the picture. Okay, so here's the Earth's surface. I appreciate Peter Ballestead for sharing this graph with me because I think it's important. Here's the Earth's surface. 66% is ocean. We haven't really figured out how to take advantage of that surface area without depleting its resources, but certainly producing things in the ocean is going to be important. We've only got 4% cultivable land. That's where all of our crops are. And 14% of rangeland. So if we take rangeland out of the picture, which is essentially what you're implying if you want to eliminate ruminant agriculture, where are we going to produce the food that gets taken away when we do that? Seeing as cellulose is the most abundant utilizable carbon source on the planet, right? Are we going to take that out of our food production in the context of 103 of the 180 countries in the world being food insufficient? It's totally irresponsible conversation to have. The other argument that you'll hear from time to time and fairly often is that, well, why don't we take out something like beef production because it's super inefficient compared to other forms of livestock production. And yeah, again, metrics matter, right? Look at this work from ROTS. This is USDA. Let's go and look at this guy's work. He's a genius in this space. But look at the pounds of feed required per pound of live weight gain of fresh milk, right? Feed efficiency. Yeah, it takes across the production system 14 pounds or 14 kilos of feed to get a kilo of beef. Sure. How much of that stuff can we eat? Literally almost none, except for the feed yard cycle. At the end of the day, if you calculate how much protein, human edible protein those animals eat versus how much they give up, it's only ruminants that actually produce more protein than they eat, produce more human edible protein than they eat. Beef, 2.5 times the amount, dairy, 2.8 times the amount of protein that they actually eat. So when we're trying to supply food to the world, it's kind of important that we measure this instead of how much grass they ate versus how much meat they put out, because the grass is not on our menu. And if we take it off of their menu, we're not going to have anything on our menu. Other measures from Anne Motet measure the same thing, essentially just the opposite way around, showing the amount of human edible protein that is required to produce a kg of protein. These are really good references. I encourage you to go and have a look at them if you want to learn more about the subject. So I guess I wiped this argument clean, hopefully made a convincing argument on this one, but you will hear this. That the animals are eating my own food. Wouldn't it be better if we just took the food that we're feeding the animals and fed them to humans? It would be more efficient, right? Well, the problem with that argument is that that's not happening. Sure, we some human edible food does enter the animal food feed cycle, but by and large, globally, 86% of global livestock feed is inedible by humans. So they're not competing for our food. And in fact, if you had to pull, they don't have the ruminants pulled out in this data set, but that number is going to be even higher for ruminants, right? Because this includes poultry and pigs and stuff that very much more directly do compete with human food supplies. So this is a stat, this is a global stat. Anyone who says that animals are competing for our food, you can point them to this reference. And again, they're utilizing all of these byproducts, these non-edible things, these crop residues, grass and leaves, entering our food system. Are we going to take that away? I don't think we're going to. The other argument that you'll hear is that, well, look at the right-hand side of that curve, right? Remember this curve right here. Remember the extreme right-hand side of that curve where we have many nations that are in excess. We've got so much excess in the West. So we need to shut down food production in those places. We need to stop producing beef in North America. The problem with that is, do you think the global demand for beef is going to go down if we stop producing beef in North America? That's not how global markets work. We're going to create a void in that supply chain, and someone's going to come in and fill it. Now, North America, or US in this case, has 6% of the world's cattle, produces 18% of the world's beef. So we're going to shut down that food supply. If we do, it's just going to get made somewhere else, right? And this is a term that they call leakage. So if we stop producing food in one place, because of the global marketplace, it's just going to get made somewhere else. And I can guarantee you that wherever it gets made somewhere else, it's not going to be made as efficiently as it is going to be made in the countries where there's excess, because those countries are really good at it and highly efficient at it. And so it will not have the desired effect. This is not local warming, this is global warming. And we need to be thinking on a global basis when we are providing or proposing solutions, because we don't want to cut off our own food supply. So I've pointed out a lot of problems here, right? And the reasons why it's not our fault or our problem, but it is our problem. The food supply of the world is our responsibility. And although we do receive a lot of negative press on it, I think that we need to be our own advocates and start talking about what we are doing and why we're doing it and why we're doing it well. So how do we do it? Obviously, I've pointed towards this. We need to utilize our grasslands and our byproducts and use balanced formulations to improve the efficiency of our animals. We've made massive strides in this area. Genetics, nutrition, all of these things that companies like Alltech and others focus on is geared towards improving the ability of animals to produce off of the land. So we are making massive strides here. We need to capture our nutrients and prevent carbon going into landfills. I'm going to speak about carbon that is in grazing and carbon that is in byproducts in a little bit, and why it's really important that we put these through cattle instead of them ending up in other places. This one's not so relevant in this group, but obviously balancing rations is important. And then I think we need to find a mechanism, and I think it will come through when people realize the complexity of these systems, that our producers need to be compensated for environmental services. This includes carbon, water, biodiversity, waste management, all of the above, probably more on this list than we could care to count today, but we do need to find a way to reward our producers for these services. Because we know that if we do this properly, if we take global cattle meat greenhouse gas emissions, and I thank Dr. Sarah Place from AgNext for this figure, but basically if we took in 2016 the world global greenhouse gas emissions and we corrected that data set to have the same feed efficiency as beef production in the developed world, we would lower the global footprint of beef production by 45%. There's a lot of technologies out today where we're talking about decreasing footprints and all of this and that. But this feed efficiency, production practices, the things that we in particularly developed agricultural countries have been working on for years, dramatically reduces the footprint of agriculture. That's how we do that. Because when we do stuff like that, this is a dairy example, and you'll forgive me for using a dairy example in a beef meeting, but I thought this was a pretty important and pretty clear example of what can happen. This is only since 2007, and maybe I'm getting old and saying that doesn't seem like that much of a long time ago, but since 2007, we need 930,000 fewer cows to produce the same amount of milk that we produce. We need almost 1 million fewer cows to produce the same amount of milk now as we did in 2007. We're feeding less feed to fill up 3,200 NFL football stadiums, and I should have changed this calculation to hockey stadiums, but I didn't have the time. Enough land saved, equivalent to the land mass of Maryland. 4 million cars off the road permanently in terms of reduction in greenhouse gas from dairy agriculture, and enough water to provide New York City for 2 years. These are massive changes in a relatively short period of time that have been put in place to improve the efficiency and the footprint of agriculture. So we've come a long way, and it's important that we can come up with examples of how far we've come, because us being the target of all of these greenhouse gas discussions is a major frustration to me. But that's not because this is not a real problem, right? I think that if we eliminate our biases on what the cause of greenhouse gas and global warming are, it's a little bit hard to get away from the fact that we are dealing with dramatic changes in atmospheric CO2 and methane. This is 1 million years worth of data. This comes from NASA and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration in the US, from ice cores, looking at what the concentration of both CO2 on the left and methane is on the right over the years. As you could tell, we can't really see the curve since 0 AD because that curve is so steep. So we have dramatic increases in the level of these greenhouse gases in our environment. Now, how much that contributes to global warming, I'm not going to get into because I'm not an atmospheric scientist, but this is fact. What I will get into, if I can get my slide to change, is what's contributing towards that, right? Lots of focus on us and on methane and cattle, because methane is a potent greenhouse gas, right? If you go onto the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration database, you can download all their data. It's quite fun to actually have fun with these data sets. Maybe that's just me, I'm a scientist, a bit of a geek, but you find some interesting things on there, like what's contributing to warming exactly. And this data set goes back to 1979. You can see on the left-hand side that fairly clearly carbon dioxide is the main contributor to global warming. Methane is a pretty strong contributor, atmospheric methane. However, when you go back to 1979, you actually took this data set and just corrected it, took the 0-point values and minused them from the entire data set. The entirety of the increase in radiative forcing, which is warming, is due to CO2. Last time I checked, cattle don't put net CO2 out into the environment. They harvest CO2 off of crops and they put it back out when they belch. Some of it goes to methane, but as you can see, methane is not the problem. This is as a consequence of taking carbon out of the ground and putting it into the air, the fossil fuel conversation. We cannot apply the fossil fuel conversation to agriculture because we work in biological cycles. There's no biological cycle when you take coal out of the ground and you burn it. We can't measure ourselves by the same metrics. It's not fair. It's not even the goal of our industry. But that's how we're being measured. That's how we're being looked at. Go open your computer and Google search for cattle and environment and see how many news stories come up and see how many of those mention anything other than enteric methane emissions. You won't find any. First of all, I told you that we don't represent those enteric methane emissions properly. Frank Mitloehner and Miles Allen's work, go look at that if you haven't, because it's really important that we actually measure this correctly. But bigger than that, we're only counting emissions. This is a biological cycle. It is ridiculous to only measure one component of a biological cycle and say this is the effect on the whole world of this biological cycle. It is totally ridiculous. And that's because we have a lot of other things to consider. Here's what we're focusing on, and we're doing it too. Here's the rest of the cycle. Hey, the ground and the land is actually producing methane too, and CO2, as a consequence of the fermentation of grasses that don't get eaten in the soil. The soil's producing methane. And you know what? You take the cattle away and the soil produces more methane. Kind of important to include that in the conversation of whether we should take the cows away. The other side of it is, hey, the methane breaks down to CO2 in about 10, 12 years, so that's important to know. But that carbon goes back down into the soil through photosynthesis. It came from photosynthesis in the first place. So there's no net carbon emission from the cycle. In fact, there is a drain. It's called carbon sequestration. We're not considering this. It's hard to measure. Totally agree. We have an entire scientific program dedicated to trying to understand how to measure this on site. But just because it's hard to measure doesn't mean we should ignore it. It is a massive drain on the system. And in fact, once again, when the cattle are on the land, carbon sequestration goes up. When the cattle are off the land, carbon sequestration goes down. Kind of important when we're talking about the emission cycle of cattle and understanding what we need to do to reduce the emissions. So we're focusing on a lot of these areas and trying to understand them and also trying to change the narrative, because that is really, really important, that this is not a fossil fuel narrative. This isn't a one-way highway. I can draw this picture for fossil fuels and it will take me 5 seconds because it's carbon in the ground, carbon in the air. Game over. We don't do that. So we came to this understanding because we formed an alliance with an operation that exists on Buck Island Ranch in Florida. It is an operation called Archibald Expeditions, which is a group of ecologists. And ecologists and animal scientists aren't usually running in the same circles, and this really, really opened our eyes to the potential of cattle production in particular, but ruminant production in general, in terms of understanding what these environmental consequences are. Because when they went through and they measured the whole cycle from an ecosystem standpoint, ruminant nutritionists measure everything that goes in and everything that comes out, and we say that's the model. But that's not the model. The ecosystem is the model. And when we do that, Buck Island Ranch down in Florida, which is essentially underwater half the year, is actually a net sequestering operation. It's really, really important. When we talk about the footprint of these animals, it's negative. And understanding that is important. And as I mentioned, I'll walk you through these real quick. When you have grazed lands, yes, your emissions are higher because you have cattle producing methane, you've got higher emissions. But your sequestration, which is the curve at the bottom, is higher as well in the opposite direction. And net ecosystem exchange, when we're talking about looking at the footprint of that operation from an ecosystem level, is negative. In other words, that ecosystem with the cattle on is taking up more carbon than it's emitting, or more greenhouse gases equivalents than it's emitting. And when you take the cattle off, you don't lose that much of the emissions because the emissions of the land go up, but the sequestration goes down. And all of a sudden, the land is net emitting with no cattle on it. Kind of important when we're having discussions about whether we should have cattle grazing our lands. So the scale of sequestration we have realized is massive compared to the rest of that cycle, and potentially massive, and the amount of potential for manipulating that scale is massive. A recent review, actually, this is QSAC 2021, and when you read this, it's in Global Change Biology, which is kind of like a climate change type of a journal, but it's not being written from our perspective in agriculture, because they try and set it up as, animals are bad type of narrative, but they end up saying that if we can figure out carbon sequestration management strategies, we have a further 45% reduction in net greenhouse gases per unit of beef to be gained if we can figure this out. So pretty important. Now, I'm winding up here. I know I am right bumping against my time, but this is another area that I think is really important for us to understand and to quantify as a potential way of bringing value into our business as well. And that's the fate of non-utilized plant matter. I've hinted at this a couple of times in like grazing, where you pull the animals off the land and the carbon footprint of the land actually goes up. That's because the carbon is actually fermenting in the soil and making methane. This happens at scale in all forms of animal production, right? We've got the stuff I showed you, the grazing versus non-grazing, but there's a lot of raw materials within our systems that we can't eat. That's because they're fiber-based. We're talking about distillers' grains. We're talking about all of these byproducts that beef and dairy cattle eat that we're unable to eat. And there's a really interesting publication that was done by Mary Doandaza and Juan Tricarico. And they basically looked at, well, what is the consequence of feeding byproducts to dairy cattle, in this case in North America? And what they found was, on average, dairy cows eat about 40 million metric tons of byproducts a year. And that the feeding of these byproducts to these dairy cows accounts for some methane production, right? You feed byproducts to cows, it's fiber digestion, chemically, that produces methane. Okay, we know about this. We know very well about this. We focus on it a lot. What would happen to those byproducts if we didn't feed them to cows? Well, first of all, we wouldn't recover any of the nutrients. So remember the first half of my presentation where I talk about food security and all this stuff? We wouldn't get any of those nutrients recovered. Unless we get some of it recovered through compost. Most of it end up in a landfill, something like that. That's our problem for dealing with everything else that we don't use right now. We put it in a landfill. Well, if you composted those byproducts, you're going to 5x that carbon footprint, because those products are going to sit in the compost and they're going to gas off and they're going to make methane 5 times the amount as if you put it through a cow. If you put them in a landfill, it's almost 50 times. And in fact, I've done some calculations. I didn't put them down yet because I'd like some people smarter in this area than me to look at them. But I did some calculations on the net amount of greenhouse gases that would be emitted if we put all the byproducts into a landfill and eliminated dairy cows. And in fact, the carbon footprint of those byproducts would be almost twice what the current enteric methane footprint is of dairy cows in North America. Twice. So understanding the contribution of cows to removing or preventing the gassing off of raw materials, which are a byproduct of cereal grain production for the most part, preventing that from happening is an ecosystem service that cows are providing, and we need to find a way to capture that in terms of representing the value of our industry. And we'll be working on a similar publication. In fact, we've started working on a similar publication to this one in the beef space that we're hoping to get published by early next year. So with that, the future of food, does it include livestock? I hope that message is clear by this point, but if it's not, give me a call and we can discuss it a little bit further. But the question that I ask is, are we going to be looking at a future where food production is primary in our operations, or where carbon is primary? Because we're the only industry in the world, agriculture, that captures carbon for a living. All other industries have to do this kind of on the side at some expense. So are we going to be farming for carbon or food in the future? Kind of facetious, but it's important. So from my perspective, we're going to go from having the most important job in the world, and that's feeding the world, to probably having the 2 most important jobs in the world at the same time. We've got to feed the world, but we may be the only people who have the ability to reverse climate change, given all of these things that we spoke about today. So with that, I'll wrap this up. I know it's been a long presentation, but it's pretty important information from my view, and I would really appreciate any questions that might come from the audience.
So at this time, we would like to entertain some questions for Dr. Holder. Please go to microphones, please. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Holder. Excellent presentation. In your opinion, why are governments and global policymakers not listening to this science? And follow-up question, do you think eventually the tide will turn and this science will overturn sort of the rhetoric on on livestock globally?
I was hoping we could start with an easy one. Crystal ball question right up front. Honestly, let's start with the first part of the question, is why folks aren't listening. And honestly, we're not telling the story. That's our responsibility. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation that we're just not telling that story loud enough. We're hyper-focusing on methane the same way that the general industry is hyper-focusing on methane. We should be focusing on methane, but not only methane. We need to be focusing on telling this whole story. I think, to address the second part of your question, that the science is clear enough and undeniable enough that we will end up having an appropriate conversation on this at some point. The question just is how much damage gets done before we have that conversation appropriately. There are a lot of groups out there that have a lot louder voices than we do. In fact, we had a conversation with, we had a panel discussion at the UN Food Security Summit last year in Italy. And I had on several experts talking about this exact stuff. And the chat of that panel discussion was completely dominated by animal rights activists. One after the other, prepared statements, links to websites. There was absolutely no discussion that could take place in the chat of that panel discussion because of that. So people have loud voices, and we need to have loud voices too. I guess that's my view without directly answering your question, Richard.
Yeah, thank you.
So we still have time to entertain some more questions. I'm sure when we have someone like Dr. Holder here, this is a good opportunity to champion for our industry. Yes, go ahead, Mike 2.
Yeah, I'm Brian Barlow from Thunder Bay. Excellent presentation. I guess my question would be, is there somewhere where we can go and have, be ridiculous, a one-pager? Because a lot of times if you start a conversation, you've lost them so quickly. Is there some way you can come back with some succinct points about this?
I think that's an excellent idea. We're in the processes of putting together a sort of standalone website that would serve as a central point of information for these types of conversations. So I think the one-pages are an excellent example. It's something you could keep in your bag and maybe have a one-pager on each of these subtopics like sequestration or utilizing raw materials or whatever it might be. UC Davis has a really good website for the greenhouse gas side of things. So if you go to, it's called Clear Center. So if you Google search for Clear Center, they have some really good, well-packaged sets of information on greenhouse gas side of things, but it doesn't really focus as much on the sequestration or the food production standpoint piece. So we're in the process of putting together a website, and I'll make sure it hits your guys' distribution system when we do launch that website, that it's going to serve as a kind of central point for that type of information.
Go ahead, Sandra.
Hi, Sandra from Brand. Your presentation was excellent. Can't believe the research you brought together. And my question is, I was fascinated with the gut and the microbial and that whole issue of irritable bowel syndrome and telling people who are diabetic to eat more beans and their blood pressure or their blood glycemic goes up. Is there money to work with the healthcare providers, that there's some joint research here between medical science and what you guys are doing in your area?
So I want to make sure that you realize that Michael's work was not our work for a start. This is something that we came across that was really, really interesting. But in terms of understanding that, the dynamics of the flow of money through the medical industry is complicated, let's say. At least particularly in the US. I know you guys have a different system in Canada, but flow of money through the US medical system is depicted by pharmaceuticals, right? That's where the money goes to, that's where the money gets made. So there's not a lot of industry money being put through to understanding what actual nutritional interventions would affect population health. There are people working on that, but there is nowhere near as much money flowing into that sector of the industry as there is into developing weight loss drugs or developing insulin alternatives or whatever it might be. Because those maintaining sick populations is the way that those industries make money, unfortunately. And the amount of money flowing through those is just flowing through programs that would focus on societal health is just not there. That money is going to be coming, governments are putting that money in, but the scale of that money from the government is nowhere near matching the scale of the money that's coming in through the pharmaceutical industry standpoint. So I don't want to sound doom and gloom on that. There's a lot of people working on this. There is money flowing into that area. It's just small compared to some of the money flowing into some of these other areas.
Yep. Go ahead, Dan, with your question.
Good morning. Very enlightening conversation that you've addressed for us here. Now I'm going to give you the easy question for the day. So with governments around the world talking about food security and how we're going to feed the populations in the years coming and whatnot, the information some of the information you shared with us today is information that our industry has been trying to get across to government and alike people for a long time. So as an expert on this type of a thing, what would be your advice? What would be the direction that you would suggest approaching with government to get this information, I don't know, how should I say, to sink in? Because it's there, but nobody's listening to it. We're going an absolute different way. And I have my own thoughts on it, but I won't say that right now because, yeah, we just won't say that right now. So I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, it's obviously one of our biggest challenges and one of our biggest responsibilities is to do exactly what you propose. The challenge in the way that I see it that we have is that the solution or the explanation is complicated. And complicated solutions or explanations don't go well in government, right? It's very much easier to talk about the fossil fuel model and say cows make methane, methane does this, therefore cows are bad. That's a super simple argument that anyone can pick up and run with. And that's why it's taken traction, is because it's so simple. Now, I just spent 45 minutes explaining to you why that's bad, why that's wrong. But when you get in front of politicians, policymakers, you don't have 45 minutes to explain that. So our biggest challenge is in packaging this information, as one of the questions earlier is saying one-pages, is we need to figure out how to package this stuff into very, very quick and simple to understand pieces of information that we can go on and blast out. We talk about the animal rights activists and the vegans and everything, and the type of information they have. It's all snippets. It's all very short and succinct pieces of information that they just blast across wide swaths of communication channels. And we have to generate the same kind of content because particularly in today's society, our attention spans are pretty short. And we need to figure out a way to provide our communications within those short attention spans. The TikTok attention span is what we have to deal with. We're going to have to figure out a way to package that information in that way if we're going to have any shot at reaching the people we need to reach.
Thank you.
Yep. Go ahead, Joe.
Wonderful presentation. Thoroughly enjoyed it. Just an amazing amount of information there. But one of the things I call them our opponents are doing is they're painting the doom and gloom picture. If you don't do this, the world will end. How do we paint the picture that if you do this, the world will end when they talk about getting rid of cows?
I think that's not to jump into the negative marketing wars, but that's a pretty good idea. We talk about some of the consequences, right? I mean, I kind of did that a little bit in saying, well, we could do this, but that'll reduce our food supply. We could do this, but that'll reduce our food supply. Yeah, take out humans and we'll fix the problem, but we might not like that much. So I totally agree. We need to come up with new strategies for how to position that, but I guess we've also got to be careful about doing it that way because we're already on the defensive, right? We don't have the advantage of being first to make the statement and say, this is what we do and this is why it's important. We're on the back foot, so we kind of have to be a little bit more constructive about it, in my view.
We still have a little bit of time. Any more questions before we wrap up? Seeing none, Dr. Holder, I love the lines, we capture carbon for a living, we feed the world, we save the world. If you ever have the time, please come to Ontario and visit us. And as an industry that has many critics, it's nice to hear someone championing for us. So big round of applause for Dr. Vaughn Holder. So as we head into break, I'm going to remind people there are a number of exhibits in the foyer. Please take the time to visit with the representatives who are here to support you. Many of these companies have also sponsored our meetings, and we thank them for their generosity and continued support.